Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. In this first hour, we have some opportunity today to talk with a good friend of this ministry, Kerby Bauer, leading spokesperson for the subjects of pro-life, pro-family, free market kinds of principles, an individual that has served in the Reagan administration, both as the Undersecretary of Education and Chief Domestic Policy Advisor. Later on, headed up the Family Research Council, and today serves as the chairman of the Campaign for Working Families, as well as the president of American Values. An individual that we value his opinion for so much, and it is just a delight, Gary, to have you once again here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's always great to be with you. I hope to come on the show sometime and not have to talk about a series of disasters, but it just seems in recent years the country just goes from one crisis to the next, and we're certainly facing many big issues today.
Well, we're going to look at the elections for just a minute, because there are some elections in our rearview mirror, but also some ahead. So we'll talk about that. But obviously, we'll be talking about issues ranging from immigration to the advance of jihadists. But I thought, since it is the election season, we're coming up on another series of primaries. Let's look back to what happened in Virginia, the 7th Congressional District. As I mentioned just a minute ago, you're the chairman of the Campaign for Working Families, and your piece that day was Virginia earthquake rocks Washington. Even after the fact, it seems to me that there are ripples being felt over what actually took place in the 7th District there in Virginia.
Well, there sure are. You know, I called it an earthquake, and so did a number of other commentators, but I have to confess, as I'm watching some of the leaders of the Republican Party process what happened in that race, it doesn't sound like they thought it was an earthquake. We had a situation here, Kerby, as you know, Congressman Cantor, a really good man, came to Washington certainly as a conservative on most issues. He's been very conservative. But over the years, he seemed to get more and more out of step with his constituents. He appeared to be endorsing something similar to an amnesty related to illegal immigration, but I think even more perhaps damaging to him, he kept saying in interviews that he was really trying to figure out a way to work closely with President Obama on the issue, that he was convinced there could be some common ground there. And I tell you, Kerby, my sense traveling around the country that in Republican primaries, the last thing that voters want to hear is that their member of Congress is looking for a way to work more closely with the president, because the last 5.5 years has just been one incident after the other of the president not working with conservatives, in fact, doing things that often look to be unconstitutional to get his own way on a number of issues.
Well, and I think as we talk about Eric Cantor for just a minute, let's be fair to say that on life issues, he's been pro-life. On Israel, an issue that you're certainly concerned about as one of the few Jewish members of Congress. Very good. So you can't say that he was defeated because he was wrong on the social issues, which I think brings you back to things like amnesty, immigration, maybe the sense that, especially since that district isn't that far from inside the Beltway in the first way, that maybe that Potomac fever that you talk about in your commentary is something to pay attention to.
Well, I think it is. I think Republicans, conservatives generally, when they get elected and come to Washington, have to work very hard to make sure their constituents don't conclude that they've come to Washington and then are transformed by the city, which we've seen happen so many times. You know, I think there's something else at work here, too. I think all the Republican leadership in the House and even in the Senate have been told by pollsters and advisors and consultants, now, don't look angry. You know, Republicans and conservatives, they look angry all too often. Well, look, people are angry. I think Congressman Cantor and John Boehner and even some of the people they're talking about who may replace Cantor are spending too much time sounding reasonable and even-tempered. There's things happening to our country that ought to make a conservative in Congress very upset, and they need to show that anger, whether it's the release of Bergdahl for 5 renowned terrorists or the headlines coming out of Iraq right now, the immigration crisis on the border, the growth of big government, the president's actions, which, as I said earlier, often seem to be ignoring the Constitution. These are things that make people mad, and I would recommend and I urge conservatives in Congress not to be afraid to show some of that anger.
Oh, I certainly would agree. Just before we take a break, it seems to me that one of the other lessons is that money doesn't necessarily buy you votes. There was a joke going around, and I think it's pretty close to accurate, that Eric Cantor spent more on steak dinners than the individual that defeated him, David Bratt, spent on the entire campaign.
Ends up that actually wasn't a joke, because Cantor's campaign spent a couple $100,000 at meetings they had at steak dinner restaurants, and that's more than the challenger spent in his whole campaign. You know, you're absolutely right, Kerby. Money doesn't decide these kinds of races, particularly in primaries.
Yes.
But I must say that in general elections, when the left particularly can outspend conservatives, what they're able to do is lie to people about what the conservative believes, and all too often the candidate that raises the most money does win in those circumstances.
Since we're talking about elections, most of what we'll be talking about will be related to American values, but I did mention the Campaign for Working Families, and I want people to recognize that supporting your organization and other groups and parties and things of that nature are very important, and money is the mother's milk of American politics, and as much as we appreciate the people that go out, the grassroots, and put up signs and knock on doors, still, this is a media-oriented society, and so I hope that some of our listeners, as we give some of your web links on our website here, find out a little bit more about how they can support some of these candidates who desperately need some of the financial support, because, as you and I already know, sometimes the Washington establishment isn't real good at supporting some of these Tea Party candidates that we really believe in.
You're absolutely right. And by the way, in the Cantor race, several people that were in that district before the election said that they noticed Cantor had wonderful, professionally made signs up in the mediums of roads and different places like that, but they kept coming across signs for his challenger that had been handmade and were actually in people's front yards. It was sort of a marker of the upset that was about ready to happen.
Interesting. We're going to take a break. We're going to continue our conversation today with Gary Bauer, who serves as president of American Values, but I also mentioned chairman of the Campaign for Working Families. We come back, though, we will spend a little bit of time talking about what has happened on our border. You know, of course, then we'll get into all the foreign policy issues, Sergeant Bergdahl, and that swap or prisoner exchange, as well as some of the other concerns happening right now in Iraq and around the Middle East. So many issues to talk about today, and we're just privileged to have with us Gary Bauer, an opportunity for you to hear from him. And as we always do, we've posted on the website a link to American Values, and do encourage you to find out as much as you can about his very excellent American Values program and the End of Day Report. We'll take a break and continue our conversation with him right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last few years, there have been a number of attacks on our nation's national motto, "In God We Trust." Recently, I had Representative Randy Forbes on my program to talk about these attacks and the victories that often we haven't heard about on most of the mainstream media. A few years ago, a bureaucrat at the Department of Veterans Affairs attempted to ban the flag-folding recitations at military funerals. This phrase was considered inappropriate and unconstitutional. May God grant you grace, mercy, and peace. A funeral home was told by government officials they could not even inform the families that they have the option of requesting prayer at the military services performed by the veterans' honor details. The U.S. Mint attempted to remove the inscription "In God We Trust" from the front of the new presidential coin. The traditional inscriptions of "E Pluribus Unum" and "In God We Trust" were moved to the edge of the coins. The architect of the Capitol refused a teenager's request that a certificate noting his grandfather's love of God, country, and family accompany a souvenir flag that had been flown over the building. The 17-year-old Eagle Scout was told that the word God could not be put on the certificate because it violated a policy banning religious and political expressions on the certificates. Fortunately, in each of these cases, the policies were changed. Representative Forbes even commented that it was good that people on radio were hearing about these victories because they're rarely reported in the media. He then went on to mention another victory. Last month, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts upheld the constitutionality of the phrase "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. There have been at least 3 failed attempts to challenge "under God" in the pledge. There's sure to be additional challenges, but for now, the phrases like "one nation under God" and "in God we trust" appear secure. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Gary Bauer, who serves as president of American Values. And Gary, we certainly were already talking about the issue of immigration, but let's talk about what has been happening down in the state of Texas. I'm broadcasting from the state of Texas today, and at that border you are seeing a flood of immigrants, but especially young children. And we've actually posted a video just a few days ago of some of the comments being made by Senator Ted Cruz about the fact that this uptick in the number of unaccompanied young children flooding across the border may in large part have something to do with the policies of this administration. What are your thoughts?
Well, no, look, Senator Cruz is absolutely right, and I'll tell you, Kerby, this is a good example about why we need to be careful when we hear arguments being made using the word compassion, that we've got to be more compassionate. Certainly as Christians, we're called to be compassionate, but here's a perfect example where in an effort to not be hard-hearted or mean toward the children of illegal immigrants, we have helped create, along with actions by the Obama administration, a humanitarian disaster on the border. People will remember that a few months back there was a big debate about what's called dreamers. These are the children of illegal immigrants that have entered the United States. And many good people said, look, we don't hold children responsible for the illegal acts of their parents. And that sounds reasonable, but then the word went out throughout Latin America and Central America that if you are a child and get into the United States, you will not be deported by the Obama administration. So sure enough, and it was almost predictable, there started to be an increase in the number of unattended children just being dropped off at the border and told by their parents to cross into the United States. That's now turned into a flood. Literally thousands of young children are coming into the country. They're being housed, in some cases, on military bases and special shelters. They're being provided medical help, food. There, of course, has to be guards, etc. And right now, this is out of control. In fact, there are projections that over the next year, as many as 160,000 more of these unattended children may enter the country. So we've got a mess in our immigration policy. It's getting worse. Our borders are unsecured. And if these children, by the tens of thousands, can walk into America, then sadly so can drug cartel members, criminals, and, God forbid, the kind of terrorists that we're seeing wreaking havoc in the Middle East right now.
Well, and again, you used some numbers that I've used when I've been on some radio programs talking about this, up to 150,000, 160,000. We are talking about children, too, and anybody that's taken young children. You have 3 kids. I have 3 kids. We remember when they were young and going to an amusement park or going to the mall or something like that, trying to herd them. And their needs are much more significant in some cases than even if you had 150,000 adults. But when you put them into facilities that were not intended for that, Air Force Base, and sometimes even behind cages and things like that, you have a humanitarian crisis, but it wasn't unexpected. Sadly, Gary, it was very predictable, and it's one of the reasons why we have to see what we can do quickly to stem the tide. Otherwise, this is just going to flood into not only Texas, but eventually these children will head out all through the countries, part of this country, and we'll be dealing with this crisis for years in the future.
There's no question about it. Now, look, one of the things that isn't getting any or very little attention is that before all this happened, our embassies in Central America and places like Honduras and Nicaragua and so forth started putting up notices that, if a child is in America illegally, they're not going to be deported. I'm told that even on some of the websites, they have remarks by President Obama, a video, saying in America, we welcome children. They are not to be punished for the acts of anybody else. Well, this word is spread in the poverty-stricken areas throughout Central America, and that's one of the reasons these parents are driving their kids to the border and just telling them to run across it as fast as they can. Just before we went on the air, I just was reading an article that our border agents now are changing diapers, warming up bottles, because some of these children are so young. And, of course, others are teenagers. And so we're now getting reports that in these holding areas, there's been sexual assaults, rapes taking place. There's even reports that some of these young girls, teenage girls, are being captured by people in the sex trade and sold into lives that we don't even want to imagine. It's so terrible. We've got this crisis. I hear almost nothing from the president. I saw yesterday that an official of the Homeland and Security Department said, well, we're going to go down and talk to the governments in Central America. He said, I'm headed down there in 3 weeks. There's no sense here that anybody in the Obama administration is treating this as the crisis it is.
You know what I think is so interesting, Gary, is there are a few of these issues where partisanship fades away. The VA scandal is a good example, and this is another one because I've seen Democratic senators and congressmen as well as Republican congressmen and senators speaking to this issue. What we don't see is, as you said, action from the administration to recognize how significant this crisis could be if indeed something isn't done quickly.
Well, yes, that's exactly right. And look, this fits into the bigger debate over immigration.
Yes.
My position has been, look, if we can get legislation through that secures the border, then we can deal with this other problem of how to deal with the folks that are already in the country. But quite frankly, Kerby, even if legislation was passed to secure the border, I don't trust the president to actually implement the legislation because we see multiple examples of laws on the books that he and the Attorney General Holder, have just said, well, you know what, we're not going to enforce that part of the law. They've done it on the marriage issue. They've done it on other issues. So I'm afraid on some of these problems, there is no solution other than getting a new president in office in 2016.
And I think this does set aside the idea that the border is secure. I mean, when you have 5-year-olds and 10-year-olds being able to make their way across the border and then surrender to border patrols, it's pretty obvious that we don't have a very secure border indeed.
I would think common sense would tell you that is exactly the case, and yet there are people in Washington who continue to speak that fiction to the American people. Well, we've secured the borders, and if you're not in Texas or Arizona or California, you may think that that's true, particularly if you're not seeing the media reports about what's happening right now.
Wow. Gary Bauer with us. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to work our way through some of these foreign policy issues, and there are many to talk about. Certainly, Gary Bauer has been one of the staunchest defenders of Israel in the Middle East, and we have certainly seen what the Arab Spring was not. It turned into a Christian winter. We'll talk about some of the persecution of Christians there, but also jihadists or Islamists on the march in Iraq and some of the other issues, and of course this prisoner trade that we've already alluded to. So lots to talk about, and we'll continue our conversation with him in just a moment. But let me mention that we are coming to the end of our fiscal year. That takes place on June 30th, and it really is critical that we end our fiscal year on a strong financial footing. So we wanted to remind you again of the way in which you can play a key part in supporting this ministry.
When a person has faith in God and believes he is responsible to Him, that faith creates virtue. Virtue causes people to willingly obey the law. When the internal control of virtue is diminished, the outside control of government must increase to restrain the people. As government control increases, freedom decreases. As the power of government grows stronger, faith in a power higher than the government becomes an enemy of the state. The government will then seek to restrain faith to increase its power, and the cycle goes on and on. Will you help Point of View equip people to make faith an active part of their lives? Our fiscal year end is around the corner, and it's critical that we end the month of June with a solid financial foundation. A few of our key partners have generously created a $25,000 matching fund. So when you give during this critical time, your gift will be matched up to $25,000. I ask you to join us in this important work that God has called Point of View to do. Together, we can make a powerful difference.
Again, we encourage you to consider what you might do to help us out financially. Again, this matching fund already at $25,000. That means your gift is doubled. And as you go to the website, you can click on the button that says double your donation now. $25,000 matching fund, faith, virtue, and freedom. And we do encourage you to support this ministry because we certainly do want to spend time, as we always do, helping you articulate a biblical worldview, giving a biblical analysis of things that are taking place, also helping you to defend a biblical worldview, since that is so important as well. You can go to the website, pointofview.net, click on that button, but also, of course, if you'd like to send a check, you can make it out to Point of View. Send it to Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Your support allows us to bring these programs to you, the great commentary we're hearing today from Gary Bauer, the website, the videos, all the things that we produce. We encourage your support. We'll continue our conversation with Gary Bauer right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this.
fight with all my life. Let your glory shine down. Let your glory shine down.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Gary Bauer, who is the president of American Values, and we're going to focus a lot of our time and attention on foreign policy now, a very important aspect as well. But Gary, just before we do so, let's, if we can, talk about some of the great resources you have there at American Values. I've said on this program many times, and you've heard me say it, that I think every listener to Point of View really needs to get your end-of-day report, and you are so gracious to send that out and educate us about those issues. It's must-reading, but tell us for just a few minutes, as we have a link there to American Values, what people can do and how they can sign up.
Well, they can go to our website, or I guess in this case to your website, and get information. But our American Values website is ouramericanvalues.com, and you can sign up. It's a free report, and we try to give people a heads up about things happening in Washington that might affect their families, their values, their businesses, and so forth. And by the way, Kerby, while you're so nice to talk about my work here, I listened to your very low-key appeal during the break for support for Point of View and your broadcast ministry. And let me just say that over the years working in Washington, I haven't found anybody that is more helpful and more effective in educating the grassroots than the work that you all do. And I know you've impacted many times battles here in Washington by making sure that your listeners know what the true facts are.
Well, thank you so very much. It's always been great to partner with you, and I certainly hope people will find out more about American Values, and of course that will also give them a link to the Campaign for Working Families, because again, we're in an election season, and I'm encouraged by seeing some of these candidates who have won some of these primaries, and I've already seen what has happened when you have people like a Ted Cruz or a Mike Lee or a Rand Paul, or I can go down a long, long list of individuals that have made a difference. So certainly it does matter who you vote for. But let's, if we can, for just a few minutes, talk about foreign policy issues. And during the last campaign, we were assured by the president in his re-election campaign that, okay, we no longer have Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda's on the run, and the war on terror is winding down. Well, apparently the terrorist army of the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham didn't get the memo, because they have been advancing all over Iraq. And this, I think, illustrates again some of the implications of a failed policy.
Well, it really does. Look, there was a lot of politicking going on, a lot of politics as usual, and some of the things that were said in Washington in recent years about this battle America has been in since the morning of 9/11. Osama bin Laden is dead, but that's one man. We obviously wanted to get him. But there is an incredible movement all throughout the Islamic world, this quickening of radicalism and jihadism that is causing the headlines we're seeing out of Iraq today, out of Syria now for months, out of Libya, which is basically turned now into a lawless situation. We saw Egypt almost fall to these radicals, but appears to have pulled back now. These are people that are dedicated to killing the infidel, to killing Christians and Jews and even other Muslims that they think are not passionate enough or committed enough to Islam. And we're seeing their handiwork every day. And, I would love to be able to say that America can turn all of its attention now to our domestic problems and stay out of wars and so forth. Unfortunately, we don't get to decide whether we're in a war or not. As history has taught us over and over again, when there are evil forces abroad, as there was with communism, as there was with Hitler's Nazis, and today with radical Islam, America has to fight back, whether we want to do that or not.
You know, one of the things you write about in your piece on American values is what you call this quasi-anti-interventionist mood. And I will be the first to say that because I do a talk show every day, I'm hearing more and more of that from our listeners who maybe are war-weary or aren't so convinced that we are that serious. And I think part of it comes from maybe an isolationist mood that has always been part of the American culture. But I think, and I think you rightly point out in your piece, that some of this simply has to do with the fact that Americans are not convinced that the president, as we mentioned just a minute ago, will actually do what he says he will do, or actually will defend our friends, and instead might sometimes bow before our enemies. What are your thoughts?
I think that's a great analysis. The American people, by and large, I think, understand that there's responsibilities that America has. I think most Americans know we've got to confront evil forces before they get so strong that the price we have to pay is much, much higher. But I can tell you, Kerby, that people strong on national defense nonetheless will email me and say, Gary, until we get a commander-in-chief that I think actually knows how to win a war, who won't back out at the last minute or who won't undercut our troops, I don't want to support any other military action. Now, one thing this week, I asked this week our people on our mailing list, would you support airstrikes in Iraq right now to try to stop these radical forces that are marching on Baghdad? And I kind of braced myself thinking that our email list might be divided. But in fact, today, when we counted them up, even with this president, it was 90% to 10% people saying, absolutely, we've got to stop Iraq from falling either to the radical jihadists marching on Baghdad or falling to the mullahs in Iran that have their own designs on Iraq. So I think even under these circumstances, Americans are still willing to use military force when it's appropriate.
Well, and certainly there are a couple of other issues that are related to this, and one of those is the Sergeant Bergdahl, if you will, prisoner exchange. And it illustrates 2 points. Number one, you talked about the fact that Muslims are not only a threat to so-called infidels, Christians and Jews, but to other Muslims. I mean, 2 of the 5 Taliban killers that were taken out of Guantanamo really could have just as easily been up for war crimes because of the fact that they had killed so many Shiites in Afghanistan. So you have that issue that we're not just talking about protecting the West from Islam and radical Islam, but even protecting other Muslims. But second of all, you've got to wonder, Gary, is 5 Taliban killers for 1 American the going rate? Is this the way in which maybe the terrorists eventually empty out Guantanamo?
I think that's exactly what the president is doing. I think he's, even though the Congress has said clearly they don't want to close Gitmo, the prison there, the president, is a very stubborn guy. I think he intends to close it one way or the other. And, of course, if he keeps making deals like this one, he will empty the place out. When I saw that we had traded 5 high-value prisoners for 1 guy that there's strong circumstantial evidence had abandoned his post in Afghanistan, I became very concerned all over again about what we will give up in negotiations with Iran right now over their nuclear weapons program. I mean, it indicates, it's another sign of the weakness of this administration. And, Kerby, you probably have noticed this, too. In defense of the president, he and some of his spokesmen have said, look, the United States never leaves any man behind. Well, that's an interesting argument for them to make, since they did leave Americans behind in Benghazi, did not send help to rescue them, and as we all know, those people were killed by the jihadists there.
Yeah, very good point. And also, of course, if we're talking about military people that are in other countries, how about a Marine in Mexico? Of course, we can, in just a few minutes, maybe after the break, talk about whether it's Miriam Ibrahim or whether it's Pastor Saeed. I mean, it seems to me that there are times to speak out and there are a few times where I'll give credit where credit is due to the president, but most of the time we are struck by the incredible silence from this administration on issues that are of deep concern to my listeners and the people that are actually getting your newsletter. So when we come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit more about what we as individuals can do. And I certainly, again, want to challenge all of our listeners to take the time to go to the web link there that we have provided for American Values, or you can go to ouramericanvalues.com and find it as well, and check out the end of day report, because this is one of the other ways we really encourage you to be educated about these issues. And we'll also, when we come back, talk about ways in which you can be involved in this political season, because there are some very important races, and those races are going to mean the difference in the future of this country over the next couple of years. And so I want to encourage you to find out all that you can about those candidates, about where they stand on the issues, and to vote intelligently on those topics. Gary Bauer, our guest, will continue our conversation with him right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back with Gary Bauer for just a few more minutes, president of American Values. And Gary, you talked about leaving no soldier in uniform behind, and certainly we applaud the president for wanting to do that, but we certainly do recognize that there are some that felt like they have been left behind, either Americans or those who are married to Americans. Two that come to mind, Miriam Ibrahim in Sudan who may be executed, and then Pastor Saeed in Iran. And it seems to me that this is a time in which we as Christians should speak out for the rights of those individuals. And I have so often said that if we were as active about supporting persecuted Christians as some of our Jewish brethren were in supporting, for example, Jews persecuted behind the Iron Curtain and those kinds of things, many of these challenging stories would not exist because we would be a force to be reckoned with in terms of public opinion.
Well, I think you're right, Kerby. Look, this administration's record on religious persecution is just abysmal. I've been shocked. I didn't expect it would be a top priority, but I certainly thought they would do enough to pass the straight face test, and instead they haven't. And in fact, the president, through the State Department and through other agencies in the government, has put more pressure on countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia on protecting gay and lesbian rights in those countries than he has in making sure that those countries allow religious liberties for Christians and other believers. We literally have threatened a cutoff of foreign aid to some countries if they don't change their laws on same-sex marriage, rights for gays and lesbians, and so forth. Now, look, I'd like to cut off most foreign aid, except for to our friends like countries like Israel and so forth. But I just think it's amazing when you have an administration putting the full weight of the United States government and our prestige on promoting gay and lesbian rights around the world while saying almost nothing about the religious rights of Christians and other religious minorities around the world.
Wow. Well, we certainly have talked about domestic policy issues and foreign policy issues, but for just a few minutes, since we are in election season, I wanted to maybe have you address what we can do. And it does seem to me that at the very beginning, of course, is the issue of education. And one of the things that we've posted in the past, and it was created by our good friend Kelly Shackelford, is called Elections in Churches. Because, Gary, as you well know, there are a lot of listeners right now that are thinking, it would really be good to maybe pass around a voter's guide, maybe to even invite a candidate or do a candidate forum, but they're in the back of their mind wondering whether or not churches can do something like that, whether that would be seen as too political, whether that would be seen as an unconstitutional establishment of religion, and after all, we're supposed to have the separation of church and state. Speak to that issue, because it seems to me that if we don't get Christians with moral values educated and then out to the polls and voting intelligently, the future of this country really isn't very bright.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And look, I think churches have an obligation, particularly when the issues involved are moral issues. So when it comes to things like the sanctity of life, defense of marriage, religious persecution, there are many issues that are grounded in moral ideas, moral values, religious values, etc. And it is perfectly legal for a church to allow voter guides to be handed out that deal with those issues. It's even totally acceptable for the pastor to address those issues in sermons, etc. Now, obviously, churches should hesitate and probably not go down the road of announcing from the pulpit who everybody should vote for. But certainly they can urge their congregation to be up to date on moral issues, and as we've talked about, take steps to make sure the congregation has accurate voting information about what the stands of those candidates are on the various issues.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because you've been in the business, as I have as well, and recognize that voter guides are so key. Right now, we're in the primary season in a few states, and, everybody, Gary, is running as a conservative, but you and I, we've been in the business long enough to know that just because they call themselves conservative doesn't mean a whole lot. So it's important to see how they voted on the issue if they're in office, or how they respond to voter guides, but sometimes they won't respond to those. But if they see that a particular candidate is endorsed by you or by Concerned Women for America or American Family Association, another candidate's endorsed by Planned Parenthood, National Abortion Rights League, they have a pretty good idea of how that individual is going to vote, don't they?
They do. Those are definitely clues about what that candidate's going to do. And, look, we live in an Internet age, and there are disadvantages, as we know, to that, but there are also many advantages. If a candidate says, oh, yes, I'm pro-life, I've been pro-life all my life, well, if you can't immediately get your hand on a voter guide or a questionnaire the candidate has filled out, just Google the candidate's name and put in the issue sanctity of life. If you can't find that candidate ever saying anything before he ran for office, never contributing money to a crisis pregnancy center, never volunteering on the issue, never having written a letter to the editor about it, you can pretty well guess he's not being truthful with you when the candidate says he really cares a great deal about the sanctity of life.
That's for sure. And I think it's also important, one last point, go down the ballot and research those individuals as well. The other day, somebody was reminding me that Rick Perry, for example, the governor of the state of Texas, really ran first in state senate, state representative, and then later on ran as agricultural commissioner and all those kinds of things. I was talking to somebody the other day that started out in city council and now is a prominent leader, matter of fact, running for attorney general of the state of Texas. So, I mean, sometimes these down races are important as well. So do the research there. But, Gary, just before we go, I want to, again, encourage people to get a copy of your end-of-day report from American Values, but also the Campaign from Working Families, because you're trying to identify some of those very important races where people that share our values are running, and sometimes a little bit more money, a little bit more grassroots support will put him or her over the edge and make the difference. And so it's really important that we learn from you some of the people that you think are worthy of our time and our prayers and our support.
Well, thank you, Kerby. We do try to do that, particularly in these primaries where we have a chance to nominate the best candidate that we would like to see then go on and win in November. And, the other thing, Kerby, people shouldn't underestimate what they can do with the people that are closest to them, their own families, their own sons and daughters, or grandchildren, and talking to them about the big issues that are affecting our country, why those young people ought to be concerned about those issues and not just trust what's in the newspaper or what some late-night TV comedian says. I heard a story the other day about a woman that went to vote with her daughter in this race in Virginia we talked about a little while ago. And it was the first time the daughter had voted, and the mother had spent a couple of hours with her going over the issues, and they both voted for the challenger in that race, a good conservative guy. And apparently a lot of other people did the same. So even if you don't feel like you're the kind of person who wants to go to a meeting and talk to 200 people, just make sure in your own household that you're giving guidance and direction to young people in your household about the values they ought to look for in a candidate.
Wonderful advice from Gary Bauer, president of American Values. Gary, thank you so very much for being with us today here on Point of View. Let's do it again.
Absolutely. Great to be with you as always, Kerby.
Just before we take a break, let me mention once again, we're coming to the end of our fiscal year, June 30th, and it is critical that we end our fiscal year on a strong financial footing. As I've mentioned before, there's some great opportunities for you to participate. One of those is the matching fund that we have on the table. You can double your donation, and I again want to encourage those of you that have maybe never given to Point of View. This is a great opportunity to have your gift of $25 become $50, your gift of $50 becomes $100, your gift of $100 becomes $200. So consider what you might do. For those of you that have supported us in the past, let me encourage you that before the end of this month, we certainly need to hear from you. You can go to the website pointofview.net, or of course you can make a check out to Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.